Okay, this section is called recognizing arguments and being able to distinguish between a genuine argument and other sorts of passages which may seem like they're arguments but aren't, because you don't have that system of premises or premise to conclusion. And this section, this lecturette, corresponds to chapter 1, section 2 of your textbook. So first, you've got warnings, right? Some passages are meant to simply warn you about something. These are forms of expression that are intended to put someone on guard against a dangerous or detrimental situation, right? And with a warning, there's no evidence provided to prove anything, so there's no argument. But often, these can sound like arguments. So here's some examples, for instance. Take cover, trying to convince you to do something. Watch out, right? So warning, not an argument. Also because there's just simply one proposition, and one proposition can never be an argument. Or look out for that banana peel. Trying to move you, trying to convince you of something just like an argument, but not an argument. Watch out for that drunk driver swerving all over the road. Those are warnings. I'm going to move rather quickly through this section. Pieces of evidence, not arguments. Pieces of advice, not arguments, right? These can sound like warnings. So these are forms of expression that make a recommendation about some future decision or course of conduct. We're always offering each other pieces of advice, right? But not necessarily arguments, right? So as with warnings, there's no evidence provided that's intended to prove or support anything. So there is no argument. There's no system of premise to conclusion. A shorthand is just, you have to have at least one conclusion and one premise. What is this passage trying to convince me of? And give me one reason why. That'll be an argument. Pieces of advice aren't arguments. Let me give you some examples. While camping in a place known for bears, be certain to lock your food in one of the containers. If these aren't provided, make sure that you at least make a bear hang for your food to make access to it more difficult. This bear hang should be made at least 100 feet away from where you're sleeping. This isn't an argument. There's no conclusion, and it just is trying to advise you of a situation, right? Or, there are a couple of things I recommend before buying that used car. First, make sure you run a Carfax report on it. Also, make sure that the title is clear and that there aren't any unpaid tickets attached to the registration. Again, these are pieces of advice, not arguments. Next, statements of belief or opinion. These by themselves are not arguments. You can make arguments for your opinions, but if you don't have anything to back them up, they're not arguments. They are just utterances of your beliefs or opinions. I can't say that enough. If I wanted to make an argument that mint chocolate chip ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream, I could do it. If I want that as a conclusion, I can turn that into an argument. I just have to provide reasons for that statement of belief, and then it's an argument. But if you don't have anything to back it up relevantly, then you don't have an argument. You just have statements of belief or opinion. So these are expressions about what someone happens to think at a certain time. Right? With these, you only have one or more belief or opinion statements, and they're unsupported by any evidence, and they're not intended to support any conclusion. So, some examples. At Acme Bar and Grill, we believe in using the freshest, highest quality ingredients available on the market. We believe in buying local whenever possible in order to support our thriving community. We believe in recruiting the most talented chefs in the area to constantly enhance our menus with the newest recipes and techniques. And finally, we believe in providing you, our guests, with a dining experience with service that's impeccable without being stuffy, attentive without being intrusive. Now, that sounds like a mission statement you might see hung up in some restaurant or printed on a menu, God forbid, right? No argument. certainly is trying to get a point across, but you don't have that system of conclusion and at least one premise to back it. You got a series of belief or opinion statements. Or I think that in a publication like Acme Weekly, we have an obligation to not only be entertaining, but to be factually accurate as well. This is just a belief statement. I think, I feel, I believe. No backup. Okay, on to reports. Reports by themselves are not arguments, right? Reports are groups of statements that convey information about some topic or event. It's just data, just information, right? Kind of like you might see in a proper encyclopedia entry or a good Wikipedia entry. Reports make no claim that they imply or support anything, meaning there's no conclusion, so they're not arguments. In other words, there's no system of inference. You can't infer anything. You can't go from, here's a piece of evidence so I can infer this conclusion. You're just getting a bunch of facts. Or you could say you're just getting a bunch of evidence, but there's no conclusion, no system. So for example, today a massive snowstorm is ripping through northern Idaho. There are whiteout conditions and visibility is less than 1 foot. The roads that are still open are dangerously slippery. There have been at least 100 accidents phoned in. Sounds like a weather report, right? There is no conclusion here. Just a bunch of facts. That's a report, not an argument. Or, the quagga was a subspecies of the plain zebra, but has since gone extinct. The quagga had the familiar zebra markings on the front part of its body, which faded into a plain brown toward the animal's rear. It's believed that the last of the quagga were hunted down in the 1870s, and the last quagga in captivity died in an Amsterdam zoo in 1883. And that sounds like if you were to see the word quagga and you looked it up in Wikipedia. I probably got this from Wikipedia. Right? Just a bunch of facts about this thing, this quagga, right? No conclusion. It's not trying to convince you of anything by offering you even a single piece of evidence. It's just a bunch of data. Oh, that's the quagga. If you were wondering, it was a real thing. It is a real thing. Okay. Illustrations, next non-argumentative type of passage that we're trying to distinguish or recognize as such as opposed to an argument. That was very confusing, but illustrations are not arguments. Okay, so illustrations are propositions about a certain subject combined with a reference to one or more specific instances intended to exemplify it. Right? You're trying to illustrate an idea, like to put in a mental picture in somebody's head so that something's easier to understand. You're not trying to support a conclusion with an illustration. You're trying to bring an example to life. Illustrate it. Right? Once again, these aren't arguments because they're not seeking to prove anything. So some examples. A succulent is a water-retaining plant that is adapted to existing in arid conditions. For example, cacti, aloe, and ice plant are all succulents. So here, you've got a statement about what a succulent is. What the heck is a succulent? Well, here's what it is. And now, for example, picture these things, right? Let me illustrate that concept for you. Cacti, aloe, and ice plant, they're all succulents, right? This passage is an example of an illustration, not an argument. Or, in cooking, thickening agents are used to make soups and sauces denser and more viscous. For instance, cornstarch, arrowroot, and flour can all be added to your soups and sauces to make them thicker. Again, you've got a sentence describing what thickening agents are. What the heck are thickening agents? Well, here's what they are. And then for some enrichment, picture these things. Cornstarch, arrowroot, flour, those are all thickening agents. You've illustrated a concept for someone. You haven't argued for it. Okay. Now, explanations. These are tricky and there is some crossover, so keep this in mind when you're doing this week's work or this section's homework or assignment, right? Sometimes the same passage can be an explanation and an argument. In some cases, those are both acceptable answers. And it's very difficult to get this concept across, because to truly understand whether somebody is giving you an explanation or an argument, it's often necessary to have context. And context is very hard to establish in a classroom, be it online or in person, but we'll give it a go. Right? Explanations are statements about why or how something is the case, right? They shed light on some event or phenomenon, right? And like I said, these can be tricky because sometimes they can be, a passage can be interpreted as both an explanation and an argument, again, depending on context. So let's look at some examples, right? Squeezing lemon juice into milk causes it to curdle. This is because lemon juice contains citric acid, which tends to lower the pH of milk. When the pH of milk reaches 4.6, the milk breaks up and the protein casein in it coagulates or curdles. So in this passage, what you're doing is, imagine somebody saying, hey, when I squeeze lemon juice into my milk, for whatever reason I'm doing that, why does it curdle? Oh, here, let me explain that to you, right? Let me give you the mechanism behind that. Right? You're unpacking a concept, but notice you've got what can be considered a premise indicator here, right? Really, you just got to think about it. Like, does this need to be argued for? Is there anything to dispute here? This is a scientific explanation, right? And hopefully you see what I mean. Like, maybe you'd be in a case where you have to make, this has to be an argument because somebody else believes that there's some other reason that squeezing lemon juice into milk causes it to curdle, in which case you might have to argue using all of these facts, but that'd be kind of weird. You know, if it's a scientific and well-established fact, and then you've got an unpacking of of an explanation, it's best to just not put it into the argument category. Let's put it that way. Or, golf balls have a dimpled surface because dimples reduce air drag, causing the ball to travel farther. Again, that's kind of a scientific example, right? How come they make them like that? Why don't they just make them with a smooth surface or with a spiky surface? Oh, they have a dimpled surface because those dimples, they reduce air drag and then the ball can travel further. I've explained that to you, not argued for it. I mean, it's a well-established fact. This is a scientific fact. So that's one way to tell whether or not something's an explanation or an argument. But admittedly, some passages can kind of walk the line between the two, and don't let that bother you. It is context dependent. Okay, and finally, we've got conditional statements. Okay, so a conditional statement is an if-then statement. And the statement that, the part that comes right after the if is called the antecedent. And the part that comes right after the then is called the consequent. So let me speak through an example here. Just if X, then Y. X would be the antecedent, and Y would be the consequent, right? So you're saying, if this is the case, then that's going to happen. If antecedent, then consequent, right? By themselves, those are never arguments, right? But they can serve as important components of certain types of deductive arguments, which we'll talk about later. But by itself, an if-then statement, no matter how long it is, it's not an argument. And sometimes you'll be missing the then in language. Sometimes you'll be missing the if in language. Actually, no, but you may be missing the then sometimes. Let me show you some examples. So if you vote for that candidate, then the economy will go to hell. That's simply a conditional statement. It is not an argument. And like I said earlier, it can, in the future, we'll see how these conditional statements can be important parts of an argument, but by themselves, they are never arguments. You're just simply making the claim that under this particular condition, you're going to get this effect or consequence. Or your child will grow up to be a sociopath if you don't start teaching her some discipline immediately. Again, this is just a backward conditional statement. You can rephrase it as, if you don't start teaching your child some discipline immediately, then your child will grow up to be a sociopath. Not an argument, simply a conditional statement. And if professional football incites violence in the home, then we should reconsider giving widespread approval to the sport. Just a conditional statement, not an argument. I mean, just to help with that a bit, if somebody said, okay, just like we've learned in other sections, look for the conclusion first, right, to unpack an argument. How would you tease a conclusion out of this, right? If I said to you, find the conclusion here, if you found one, you'd be wrong. It's that simple. There is no conclusion. You're simply stating, you're making the claim or the proposition that under this condition, you're gonna get, or this will apply as well. That alone is not an argument. So, what did we cover? We covered recognizing arguments, distinguishing arguments from other sorts of seemingly persuasive passages like warnings, pieces of advice, statements of belief or opinion, reports, illustrations, explanations, and conditional statements. And again, this corresponds to Chapter 1, Section 2 of your textbook.